Hi, I'm Dr. Kyla, paediatric dietitian, fussy eating specialist, and mum of two. I'm the founder of the online mealtimes memberships that help parents just like you experience a confident and guilt-free way of feeding children. I'm also a business owner, a hot cross bun lover, and my superpower is finding things that you cannot live without. In this podcast, I'm talking about feeding your family, along with a random selection of topics that tickle my fancy. Welcome to Mealtimes with Dr. Kyla.
Hello and welcome to today's episode. Today's guest is Lauren Pike, occupational therapist and head of the Western Kids Health feeding team. Lauren is one of my all-time favourite clinicians in the whole world, but I'll throw to her to introduce herself and tell us a bit about what she does. Hi, Loz.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so thrilled to have you.
Thank
Interrupted
you.
your introduction though. Talk to me. Who are you?
You've
What do
already
you do?
said the key parts. My name is Lauren and I'm an occupational therapist, but I work as a feeding therapist pretty much with Western Kids Health. I do lots of work with kids who are 6-month-olds right up until late teens who are really struggling with eating. I've got my own kids who I have to feed daily, who are not smooth sailing, so I get lots of practice in what I do because despite being a feeding therapist, as you know, it does not change the personality of your kids or take them away from developmental norms. So
Don't we know? I know that so strongly, as
Yeah.
my 6-year-old told me last night. These sausage rolls actually smell a bit funny, so I won't be having them.
Yeah,
Good
it
times.
doesn't, just because what we know does not make our children play the game. So I get
Gold.
lots of practice. I practice what I preach. Lucky enough to not have to feel stressed about their poor eating. But at Western Kids Health, I do run a beautiful team of multidisciplinary therapists. So we have myself as an OT, but we also have speech and a dietitian and a psychologist where we can really help look at what's going on for these kids who find eating really challenging and work towards fixing it.
Love it. So Lauren and I actually used to work together on a mealtime management team as part of a government health service, maybe 10, 12 years ago, I think
More
it
than,
was.
at least
Was
12.
it?
Yeah,
Gosh. Oh, wow.
I would say so,
We
yep.
we used to visit families in their homes and really work with them to understand their challenges. We did lots of kind of different food-based therapy. We ran some groups in the work that we were doing. And essentially, we kind of trained each other at the time, didn't we? We were kind of going to professional development and really, we were both so involved in feeding. Like we just loved helping families who were struggling with this. What's your memory of that kind of time, Loz?
But being the favourite part of my week amongst,
Yes.
early child development, that was definitely my favourite one day a fortnight, actually, that we got to do together. And I do remember the two of us working really hard to make what we could do as good as it possibly can be. We were trying lots of new things. We were meeting lots of new families. And I think that's when you identified that there was a greater need when you started a different business. But then we kept going together.
Yeah, that was I was so lucky to have that. So in about 2015, I started my own private version of what we were doing to service kind of a bigger range of families in Perth. I had some interstate, but mostly in Perth. And then when I went on maternity leave in 2017, I was lucky enough that Lauren was returning from maternity leave for her first child. And so she took over the business while I had my first baby. And then we kind of swapped it back and forwards again for a little while we finished our families. And then Lauren moved to Western Kids Health once I passed my kind of business on to them and set up this brand new team, much bigger than just you and me when we were running it. And we definitely had our own challenges trying to just be two mums who were running a business, trying to get across, most of the metropolitan area and work with families. We did end up with a clinic at one stage, but now it's so nice to have it housed in one beautiful spot like Western Kids Health and to have a team that you're able to build.
Yes, definitely. I think as good a work we were doing on our own, I think we always knew we needed more. And with the wait lists in Perth and not having a great connection to refer on to, creating something in one place as a full team has been amazing and the much better work can be done.
And I just remember the stress, Lauren, of us sitting down and being like, our wait list is 6 months at the moment. Like, how do we possibly fit all these kids in and how do we help them? And like both of us, I think, and I think this is probably true of any good clinician, take on, a lot of our family's challenges. Like I remember most of the names of the kids that I've worked with. I remember specific scenarios, I can picture them and the challenges that they have. And so it's a lot to hold when it's just a couple of you. So obviously, I think a team makes that much nicer.
I think it's our superpower, Kyla. We'd say, do you remember that kid that lived on this road? And you'd be like, yep, that one. And we'd remember and we'd brainstorm and we'd say, this kid is like that kid, and we'd solve the world.
And then also be really little nuggets. Do you remember, like, you'd say, oh, do you remember this kid from 2017? I'd be like, oh, was that the one who only ate Cheerios if they were like this? And you're like, yeah, that's them. Oh, how funny. We love it. All right. So when Lauren and I did work together, we realized pretty quickly that a lot of our clients seemed to have a type almost. So I will preface this by saying every child is 100% unique, and the way that we respond to all of our kids is really dependent on their specific needs. But in the same way that when you're dating, you might have a type, I think when you have a fussy eater, there are common or commonalities between different sorts of kids. So we thought we would talk through them today, and Lauren can give you a bit of inside information, I guess, about how she works with those families. And if you're listening and you have a fussy eater, you can kind of have a think, like, is that my child? Is this some of the challenges that they're facing? And what does that kind of look like? So when we think about child number one, we'll start with our youngest ones. These are our bubs who are just not keen on solid food from day dot. These are kiddos that often have had a tricky time with breast or bottle feeding since early on. They might have had some kind of feeding aversion early. They're the babies who tend to not put toys in their mouth. They're kind of big gaggers, any kind of flavor or texture. They're gagging often to the point of vomiting. They're babies who are squeezing their mouth shut and pushing the spoon away and refusing to be fed. They're often crying when they even see the high chair. They're dropping everything onto the floor. They're spitting food out or kind of holding it in their cheeks. They are quite a type, aren't they, Lauren? And obviously a huge challenge for parents when, this first foray into feeding feels so tough. Are these ones you see regularly in clinic, Loz?
Yes, and I think you described the child really well, and I think what often goes hand in hand with that is the family dynamic that ends up with these really tricky kids who are struggling with solids. So often the parents are extremely stressed because it's our job, which is a factor of all the children that we're about to talk about, but of these 6 to 12-month-old babies who aren't taking to solids, it can feel like a real personal attack on the parent and that they're failing at their job to keep their child thriving and alive. There's often been a history of weight concerns or growth in those early days. So whether the baby was pram or tube fed or just struggling with weight can be very stressful to then introduce solids without putting a certain amount of expectation on their child that they might thrive and love it. And so then it often can become a difficulty when breastfeeding or bottle feeding was difficult and we thought solids was going to be the answer, and that has actually just continued the trajectory of
it's salt in the wounds, isn't it?
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I think what's been really nice in the last little while of working, maybe in the last 6 to 12 months, is previously when I saw a lot of 6 to 12 months old, it was a very much, when you would have seen them in clinic as well, a big chunk of them were doing actually quite well. And it was just reassuring parents what developmental norms are. Your 9-month-old doesn't have to eat half a cup of puree, this is the difference. That gag is great, like doing a lot of really good education there. I think in the last year, I think there's some better information out. Baby mealtimes, I think you've done a lot of work with child health nurses. I've done some work with child health nurses. I do think, and I am seeing less of the kids who are doing really well coming into the clinic and less of that managing worried parents. There is less of that, but it does mean those babies that are coming in now, they do have some significant difficulties that we are trying to really work towards.
Yeah, and it's often not something, for these kids who have had a rough run with feeding from the very start, it's often not just something that spontaneously resolves. We do have to get to the bottom of it often and understand why that is so challenging and often painful for those kids. And, if you've got a baby who's in pain when they're eating, there is no way that they want to keep doing that thing. And so understanding kind of what's happening for those bubs is critical. I do think feeding babies is a big game of comparison too. Like, there is I probably more so at that point in your life or in your stage of parenting, you see what other babies the same age are doing. And, there seems to be a lot more variation in toddlers and older kids. But when you compare a 9-month-old to another 9-month-old, it's
It's so
really
direct.
easy to lose your sense of
Yeah.
confidence around what's happening for your
Yeah.
baby.
You're at a mother's group and that child or the parent is like, look at these photos of spaghetti bolognese smeared all over their face. And oh my gosh, I have to get them another yogurt pouch. And then your baby's throwing the food. It's demoralizing and really
Yeah.
hard.
It is really hard to hold that long game in your mind.
But
And so definitely.
there's so many factors that contribute to those children that have difficulty eating. And I guess that's my job, is to really try to figure out what is going on, explaining to the parent why I think what's happening is happening, and then like developing a really targeted plan for that particular child. Like I'm seeing a 10-month-old at the moment, been seeing her for about 6 weeks or so. She came taking very little food at all, very little. It would fall out of her mouth, so she wasn't even spitting it. It was just like yogurt would just come back out of her mouth. Never accepted the spoon, clamps her mouth shut, like that classic refusal, didn't put toys in her mouth. History of constipation. The weight charts, child health nurse had told mum and dad that weight wasn't tracking along very well and had them in for frequent ways. When myself and the dietitian looked at the chart, there was literally no concern. We don't actually know why they were ever told to be so concerned. So, that history just keeps repeating and repeating. And we're just struggling with food. Her chewing wasn't doing so great. So we had to target like quite a lot of things, like how do we teach her to chew a little bit better? What kind of foods would be best for her at this stage to push her a little bit further? But how do we also develop some happy meal times in this family where it's really quite stressful and the child is also quite stressed and doesn't want to kind of explore or touch food? Because if we don't have that first, even though she can't chew well either, she's not going to get practice if she's not interested. So it's big picture stuff, looking at when we feed her and how we feed her and what words we might say and all of that sort of stuff, problem solving together.
You raised a really good point around weight there or growth. And I think as health professionals, we sometimes don't consider the impact of this obsession about weight and growth in those early months and how much that can impact the relationship at mealtimes. That if you are, as a parent, so caught on how many milliliters they've taken or how many spoonfuls or how much they're not having, it's really hard to enjoy the process and hard for your baby to learn to enjoy eating. It becomes a chore and a stress for everyone, which, has ongoing impacts, right?
Mm-hmm. I know when
Yeah.
my oldest was about 9 months, he took a very long time to be interested in solids. He was perfectly happy in the high chair. He'd taste everything, but the volume consumed was very, very small. And I was totally fine with it until we went to the child health nurse and they showed me a picture of a bowl and said, is he eating this much every mealtime? I said, he doesn't eat that much across the day. And she's like, oh, no. I mean, there was no concerns with weight. There was like no other indicators that this was not right, other than this amount she decided he should eat, he was not doing. Anyway, I went home stressed to the eyeballs. My first child wasn't eating. I fed him, I force fed him, I stopped offering new foods. I just gave him the toast and peanut butter that I knew he liked, because at least he might eat a quarter of a piece of toast instead of one mouthful. And that went on for a few days. And my husband said, Lauren, what would you tell somebody else you were working with? I'm like, oh yeah, let's try to take a step back just a little bit. And sure enough, he was a classic slow to warm. So he was a classic, like actually everything was going fine. He just didn't really need to do much more at that point. He just wanted to explore. By 10 months, he was like, oh, I can eat. I enjoy food. And once we could get that focus back to enjoyment, luckily for me, that stress only lasted about 3 days, but there were tears in that time. There was attempted force feeding. There was changing what I was offering, all the things that everybody does really naturally to try to fix this problem they think they have. And I would just love better for everybody else that I work for.
I know. I actually remember, Lauren, having coffee with you maybe 2 days after that, 3 days. And when you kind of confessed, like, this is what I did and this is what this woman said. And I was so impacted by it, even though I don't believe her, what she said. I remember exactly where we were. You probably
I do too.
have the same experience.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Shall we talk about our next one then?
Yes. We have kids who just are classic fussy toddlers, hey?
Oh, textbook. These babies. So these are the I don't want it toddlers. So tell me what you would kind of typically see in these ones, Loz.
They probably ate everything as a baby. They ate the broccoli and the sweet potato and also the bolognese and, just enjoyed food. They probably ate sardines. I wouldn't, but
Yeah.
the 10-month-old
I think
probably did.
the definition is like, he used to eat red duck curry. Like, seriously, what's happened to this child?
Yeah. And then they hit around 18 months and it starts just slowly dropping away. They start being more demanding for the foods that they like. They might reject foods. They might eat 7 bananas one day and don't touch it for another week. They need screens to have on the TV, like while they're watching. They prefer to nibble all day rather than have some meals.
Or they're asking for milk all day long.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Mhm.
And often this is the age of no veggies, no meat. They're the kind
Mhm.
of big. Tell us about veggies and meat.
Veggies and meat are so inconsistent. So every time you have a chicken nugget, it's going to be exactly the same. It's so safe and predictable. It's easy to chew. It's the same color. The texture is the same, both on the outside and the inside, and nothing is variable. When you do meat or vegetables, everything about it changes every single time you eat it. So how green is the broccoli depends on how long it was cooked for, or how long it was in the fridge for, or how long it was even on the shelf for at the shops. And then did we add a sauce to it this time? So does it taste a little bit different? Or did we cook it a little bit longer so it's softer than last time? If it changes too much, similar things can happen for meat, but also meat is a trickier texture to manage via chewing. So maybe they haven't quite developed the skills enough yet, or perhaps they have got the skills, but they can't be bothered by the time it comes to dinner because I'm a tired 2-year-old and I don't want to eat steak. I want to have my milk and go to bed.
Yeah. Or I want to play on the floor and actually have nothing to do with this meal because I'm also growing less at this age. And we forget, I think often as parents, your kids are getting bigger, you're thinking, okay, well, they're going to be eating more. And often in this toddler phase, they're actually eating less. Their growth rate has slowed right down from since when they're a baby. And so we see that particularly at dinner time, most toddlers are doing a pretty good job of eating earlier in the day,
Mhm.
and that dinner time one is often a big challenge. Tell us about any of these you've got in clinic at the moment, Lauren.
These are the kids that I do a lot of work with their parents. To be honest, we don't do a lot of in-person work with these toddlers. So they are just kids. Like I've got one little one at the moment who's almost 2 and is just very much controlling the narrative at meal times. And he will say no to almost everything, but then come back, says, I'm not hungry, I'm not hungry, I'm not hungry, and then come back 20 minutes pointing at the kitchen or the fridge or opening the door himself and getting snacks. And it can be very hard in that situation to hold any sort of boundary or not worry about your child because you just want them to eat. So it ends up being lots of support for the parents to put in some practice that they feel good about, but that will also help the child so that then feeling confident in how to manage that daily grind. That's really what I do for the 2-year-olds. I help them understand the chicken nugget versus the broccoli that we talked about, looking at any complex medical history that might have been going on for the child, and just really brainstorming with them in a way that can only happen when you get to know the family individually and say, so when your child does this, when he's doing that drive-by at the table to say, oh God, I'm not sitting down, what do we do to get him to sit down? Like, how do we change the environment, or how do we change what that word that we're going to use to convince him that maybe it's not so bad? How do we create safety for that child?
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful to understand for these younger kids, like the eating part is often the only sense of control they have in the bigger world, right? So they're growing into this toddler brain where they do want to be the boss, they do want to rule the roost. And part of that is a really normal part of toddler development. And this is one of the only things they kind of have a strong sway in because, as a parent, your natural instinct is to, okay, you don't want that. What else can I get you? You don't want this now? Okay, well, I'll feed you a little bit here. Okay, I'll follow you around with food if that's what I need to do. I know you'll eat more at the park, so we'll go there.
Yep.
And that real kind of, we fall into patterns that actually just don't help. And if anything, probably make things harder. But it's
Yeah.
really tricky to step out from that when
I
you.
think when I used to be in homes, you could see great parenting all the time, like really connected parents with their children who respond really beautifully and emotionally. And when the child's banging on the table, they're like making a racket, if it was appropriate to tell them to stop, they could, or if they were trying to get the iPad and it wasn't iPad time, the parents would calmly and confidently say, no, it's not time. If they wanted to go out in the rain, they would be able to stop them from doing that. But then when they asked for a banana 5 minutes after not eating rice, it was this real pull to say, oh gosh, I actually have to give them that. I don't want to. It's not what fits with my parenting ideal, or it's not what I want for my life, but my toddler might die if I don't feed him this banana right now.
I feel like I have no option.
Yeah. And so it's helping families nut out that like real nitty gritty in a really challenging developmental time. So we know that 18 months to 2-year-olds are going to be fussy. Like, that's lucky you if you did not experience that in your family. And so when a couple of days ago, I had a little boy in, he's about 16 months. And so he's had challenges, right? Like he has a poor eating history, poor stomach complaint, like things have been really hard for him. He doesn't chew very well, but we're working on that and it's going really well. But I'm telling the parents, he is about to hit toddlerhood. Let's get in some really good practices now so you feel confident riding that out rather than it getting worse. And let's not expect massive changes in what let's put some developmental norms in here. Let's not expect him to go back to eating curry and fried rice and like every vegetable under the sun, but how do we help you not feel stressed throughout that next 6 months period?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point, because it's not about not giving him the opportunities or not offering that, but it's being really reasonable with, like, he's probably going to throw that on the floor sometimes. He's probably going to completely ignore that food sometimes. Maybe occasionally he'll have a try of something and you'll think, right, we're on a winner here, I'll cook this again, and then they flat out refuses the next day. And all of those are to be expected essentially at that age.
Mm-hmm.
But having a clear philosophy about kind of what your role is and how you can respond to that is a game changer.
Yeah. The best thing someone can tell me is, yeah, they're not eating so much yet, but I feel really confident and I'm not stressed at mealtimes anymore. And I think, gosh, if we can get a mum and dad not feeling stressed at mealtime, we have won the war. That is actually all that matters.
I think we've had conversations previously about our lack of stress around eating. Like, it is such a free pass almost for us to just not have to live that day to day, to actually trust the process, trust what we're doing, trust our kids, even if they're never going to be the most adventurous eaters in the world. I don't have to waste my mental energy counting every bite and, tracking all the things. It's such a gift.
Totally. I have an almost 8-year-old who is, I can honestly say we are seeing some upwards trend in his eating now, which is quite lovely to see. And there's been times though when people have come in and they've talked about their 4-year-olds and they've filled out their food list. I'm like, I wonder how that compares to my child's diet. And I guess what's lucky is there is no stress in my family home from my child or myself. So yes, he hasn't always at times eaten that great. He's an anxious kind of kid. He, if life is tricky, so is food. But we tend to ride those bumps out quite smoothly. And then I know when he's calm and happy, we see an improvement again. And that's what I want for everybody.
Yeah. So that is exactly what I want. Talk us through number 3, the white food only child.
So this would be the classic bulk of my caseload. So the white diet could honestly start from 6 months until, I don't know, 99 years old. I think people don't always grow out of these things, which is the kids that we see.
It's a first trimester diet as well when you're pregnant. The beige diet, white diet.
So this is, I think lots of people would be very familiar about a child, like they've either got one or they know of someone who likes beige food. So crackers and nuggets and yogurts, and they might eat a banana if you're lucky because it's beige, but it's also got a very funny texture, so maybe not. They probably want to avoid meal times or not sit with families. They might gag a bit if they've offered new food. So I think we've seen kids gag at even the thought of meal times. Do you remember the baby that gagged at the sound of a blender? It's not just about taste or not about not being able to swallow. It's sometimes a thought or the feeling associated with these foods that are not beige that can be really problematic.
And the beige thing is, again, that trust point that we were talking about before. Like the foods that a lot of these kids feel comfortable with are the ones that they've learned to trust because they don't change. And some of our kids are very specific about brands to the point that they will eat this brand of yogurt, but not this brand of bread, not this brand, because they need it to be so much the same each time so that their body doesn't freak out when they see it or taste it or smell it or any of those things. And that can be a real challenge for families to find a way out of. Who have you got in your clinic at the moment?
So we've got all of them.
Everyone.
Everybody. But it's a great age to work with. So if I'm thinking, I mean, as I said, the beige could be for everybody, but I'm kind of thinking about 3 to 6 year olds who would be very common to have. And so how I would always work with them is starting with a parent. So I'm thinking of a little girl who is 4.5 at the moment. So the first couple of sessions were with just mum and sometimes dad, where we really talked about sensory processing and explained why the beige diet is so important for her and why anything else is a threat to that regulation system and how she feels comfort and safety at a mealtime. So spend a lot of time working on that background, because if we can get her feeling good at mealtimes, we can then at home, and for the girl to know that, hey, mum's got me. She's not going to trick me into liking something else, because I can tell you that girl could spot when mum changed the frozen fruit in the smoothie that she was very trusting at mealtimes, at breakfast. So once mum and dad were on board and maybe no longer tricking, even though it felt really good to get, half a leaf of spinach in at breakfast, having big picture looking like, does it matter what she ate at breakfast on the 30th of July, 2024? Like, no, let's have big picture. What are we hoping for her? Once we did some really good work, and they worked really hard, this took a few sessions for the parents to feel really confident that they weren't putting any accidental pressure on their little girl to eat or to be convinced or bribed or tricked. Once we got there, we then got to do the fun stuff in the clinic. And so she comes and sees me and we sit across the table from each other and we just play with food. And it sounds like quite naff, and you could Google what to do with your fussy eater and it will say play with food. And I hate it, even though I've just described it like that, because I do it very strategically in a way that the child is involved. And what I'm aiming for is for that child to learn to wonder about food. So some feeding therapists might work towards goal foods, or they want their child to eat this, or I don't believe in that. I don't think we should have a goal in mind of we want their child to eat carrots in 4 months. I am more hoping for that child to learn to wonder. I wonder if that carrot is as hard as a stick, or I wonder if when we microwave it changes taste or texture or like look. Or yesterday, another little boy, we were doing some Fruit Loops and he was fine with them dry. And I was like, I wonder what happens when we add milk. And he got not as impressed by them. Like he was much less likely to eat them, and he didn't. But his mum and I were surprised that he even stirred the bowl with a spoon, because he doesn't mix anything. So the fact that we put 2 safe foods together and he explored and checked what they were like and let me squish them, that was such a win, because he was able to wonder about how a food can change. And so if we then can take that at home to some degree, so I wonder if that mashed potato is as hot as it looks. That's what I'm hoping for.
It's a sense of curiosity rather than a sense of determination, right?
Totally.
Here's what maybe will happen. And I wonder what this kid will show us as well as a parent, right? So if it's wondering from the kid's point of view, but it's also watching on and thinking, I wonder what he's going to do in this situation. I remember a similar therapy session with a kid where I sprayed the milk onto the cereal with like a spray bottle, and we kind of looked at what those things did. Good times.
Yeah.
We love working with these kids. It's so fun.
My goal is never for them to eat the foods that I bring in session. Like, we target the foods. Like, I'm not going to bring out something that would be so far from their sensory preferences that they won't even want to engage at the table. But my goal is for them to learn that food can be safe, it can be trusted, and that they can enjoy food rather than just say no. Because lots of parents say, oh yeah, they can keep the pea on the plate. Doesn't bother them. There's no tantrums. But I said, do they look at it? Do they know it's there? Like, I find that they have like horse blinkers on. So, yep. The pea is there, but they can only see the sausage. And so that it may as well not be there. So how do we get them to acknowledge that it's there and wonder about that food?
And that, I think you kind of said it, it's very strategic, but it's very nuanced. And I know that you spend a heap of time kind of thinking about those foods and thinking about how to, scaffold to them and create that sense of interest. And I don't think it's something that, I mean, general therapists can do, but equally that parents can do at home. Like it does take a lot of skill and what's the word I'm looking for? Like it's really quite strategic.
And I think you and I, when we worked together, a decade ago, we used to do it, right? We used to do the food plate and then we'd send them, go and do this. Like do this at home. And then it was never working. And you and I did have a chat, like why do they do so well in our sessions, but why don't they seem to do as well at home? And we had to really figure out what the difference was. And the difference is that as much as I absolutely love my job, I think it's fabulous, wouldn't want to do anything else, I just am very happy if they do one extra thing that they couldn't do at the beginning of the session. Just one thing is great. If we can get a few more, even better. But as a parent, you're just so tempted to push it a little bit. Like, why would you be happy with A when we could maybe get D?
And you're too emotionally involved, right?
Too emotionally
Like,
involved.
You're
so
still
then
thinking like, oh, we'll get to the next one and then we'll be on this and then we'll do this.
So my job the parent's job is to create a safety during mealtimes with safe foods or whatever is appropriate for that family. My job is to get the child to wonder about food. And when both things are working quite well together, then we blend it in at home and we add some more stuff to do.
Gosh, I love that. Oh, this is why you're one of my favorite people, Liz. All right, let's talk about child number 4. This is our kind of last example that we'll talk about today. So these are often our scared of new foods kids. These can present at any age, but we tend to see them kind of in later primary school, early teenage, late teenage even. And they're kids who have a very small number of foods that they'll eat. They're quite rigid about what those foods are. They're definitely not wondering about other foods. You have to take your own food often to restaurants, to grandparents' houses. These are kids who get worried about what's going to be served at friends' houses. They don't want to have sleepovers. They're often worried about things like camp. They're really completely shutting off. Like there's a curtain drawn across their face if you talk about a new food. Very limited kind of dinner options that you can rotate through. Really stuck and worried kids, right? Anything to add to that kind of list?
Yeah, so if those children were under 7 or so, I would do very similar to what we've just talked about and perhaps involve other team members as required. But once they get over 8 and that frontal part of that brain might be kicking in a little bit and we can do a little bit more of that thinking kind of therapy, this is where it gets quite good. And I know the dietitian and I really love working with these kids because they are often super motivated. They don't often want to be the only kid taking their own food to camp, or they don't want to not go to a friend's house, but they are choosing not to because they don't know what dinner is going to be. And so these kids are great to work with. Progress is just as slow as with the younger kids, but they're so motivated. They want to do a little bit more. And I think the very best thing about working here at Western Kids Health is that we do have that full team, and we will quite often involve psychology for some of these kids. And part of my job when I first meet them is to really figure out is feeding the main difficulty in their life and their main worry, or is feeding the external symptom of a bigger anxiety disorder. I often find that parents might come in and say, oh, we'd really love for them to eat more. But when I look at it, I'm like, oh, he's just controlling the one thing he can control about. Let's send them on to psych for a little while. And then if we need to do some feeding therapy, we can do that as well. But it's really just assessing what might be kind of going on. But with these kids, I've got lots on my caseload, a few 12-year-old boys at the moment who are doing fabulously, but we sometimes send them off to psychology for a little while to get some good anxiety management strategies under their belt, and then they come back to me and we put them in practice while we're doing our feeding therapy. Some don't need that psychology support and we just jump straight into feeding therapy with our own analysis and our own support. We do lots of goal setting with the child. We get the child to pick the foods that we're going to explore. We learn to investigate foods similar to the younger children. I want them to wonder, but we can be so much more concrete. How many things can we find in this food? What different textures? Give it a score out of 10. What does the smell like? Does that bother you? Or how do we make it better? We do a lot more investigations and fixing of the food that is presented. And then they will have more regular homework. So if you liked these crackers, that we tried brand new today, when are you going to eat them? Like, how do we keep the rotation going? Because if we just leave it, that they may have loved it in our session, but when you're presented with a pantry of safe foods, it can quickly drop off the list again. So it's been really concrete and putting ownership on that team to really try their best to incorporate it, reminding them of their own goals. And yeah.
I remember being like consistently amazed at some of the problem solving these kids can do. If you ask the right question, you can, like, it's just, so much better than suggestions I would come up with. And so I
Yes.
love that, like, collaborative work with these kids who have just never kind of thought about food in this way, that you can do it in a way that doesn't overwhelm you. Like, it just isn't about trying to eat it. And when you build these kids' confidence, they often learn to do a lot of the problem solving themselves, which we've probably learned as adults. If there are foods that you don't like as an adult, you've probably learnt ways. If you're bothered by texture, you probably order the chips instead of the mashed potato when you go out, or, you do different things that isn't necessarily socially acceptable for young kids to be able to do. And so I love that, a lot of that comes from them.
Yeah, and they want to do a little bit better. Like, I had one girl who, she was 15 and 16 when I was working with her, and her goal, she had a great circle of friends, and her goal was to be able to go to the places that she sees on Instagram to go and eat with her friends. And I was like, that's great. Like, that's what, because she would often go home at the end of the movies instead of going to the restaurant or like to boost juicy. Like, she wanted to be able to just join in that last part of that social activity.
Less.
Yeah.
And life-changing for these kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is, socially, that is such a big part of them and their identity and what they do and how they feel about themselves. So powerful.
And it's also really confidence building. Like, quite often these kids will say, I don't like food. And then we do I do a list with them, like foods that they already eat, things that would be easy, medium, or hard to kind of eat. And often that food I already eat, the list is actually quite long, but it's kids' food, it's beige food, but it's long. And I think when they see it written down in comparison to those other foods, like, oh, I do actually eat well. Or I had a little, she was about 12 or 13, and she used to say, I don't eat mixed textured foods. True though. And she's like, yeah. And I said, what do you put on your ice cream? What do you like? Would you be able to dip a biscuit into some yogurt? And she was like, yes. I'm like, okay, so if it's sweet, we don't have a problem. So I don't think it is that you don't like mixed texture, and so we just kind of can problem solve, challenge some of those ingrained thoughts that they've probably been told that they're fussy since they were 4, and just really try to, get some more positive thinking in something that's really challenging for them.
I love it. And I'm interested to hear from people who are listening whether they can strongly identify, with one of the types that we've described. Because, of course, there are always kiddos who fit into multiple categories or have their own additional unique challenges. And part of what, the challenge as feeding specialists is for us to get to the bottom of that and to work out what will work for those kids. And that is such a high when you work that out, isn't it? It's such a rewarding feeling.
And it's definitely not up to a parent to be able to figure that out. When you're in the daily grind, like, often people come, like, particularly with those little babies, they'll say nothing has changed. And then I look at them eat and I can see so much improvement in their oral skills. Or the toddler comes and instead of looking at the food quite warily, they're like straight into playing with the table. I'm like, you don't notice the difference because daily you're battling over the thoughts in your mind that they need to be eating vegetables and meat. But actually their acceptance and tolerance and skills are improving. It's just too tricky to see. And so it's too tricky to work out what's going on, and it's too tricky to manage those like expectations and change.
And I would say it's too tricky to find the time to do anything specific about it, because so we don't even like get to finish the homework reading book most weeks. Like, it is tricky being a parent. There is so much on your plate. And so finding time to do very nuanced, very, delicate things like this, you really do need someone who can guide you in that. So if parents do want to work with you and the team, Lauren, what's the best way to find you?
So I work at Western Kids Health, and we can provide the website. I'm sure there's an inquiry link there for the feeding team. You do not need a referral from anybody. You can refer yourself. Just fill that out. It has a bit of information. Quite often, myself or another team member will have a chat to you to see who's the right fit for you, and we can go from there.
Sure, I'll put them in the show notes. You guys, Western Kids Health, are based in Perth. What about if people are outside of Perth?
Yep, so we are currently in Shenton Park or Hillary's. So we have 2 offices at the moment, which our feeding team work out of at the moment. But we do definitely work telehealth. We have some overseas, we have some country, and we have some interstate patients at the moment. So we are very happy to support via telehealth if you're a child and you are interested.
Which reminds me of when we had to shift to telehealth during those COVID years, how surprised we were that some of the food therapy stuff actually translates really nicely across the
Yeah.
screen, which we did not expect to be a thing.
If it was not for COVID, we would not know that was possible. So we used to decline interstate requests until COVID happened. And then we kind of were forced to either shut up or try to adapt. And it was quite successful. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, all the times we've had, lots.
So
Thank
many.
you so much for your time today. Really insightful. I love talking about feeding kids with you, and I'm really glad that I could share you with the podcast listeners.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.
A huge thanks for tuning in and listening to my podcast. This is all brand new for me, so I'd love to hear your feedback. Give me a review or send me a DM. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And above all, I'd really love you to hit that subscribe button to keep listening. Thanks.